Greetings, friends, and welcome back to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion podcast. I'm JJ Kimche. The 14th of May 1948 was one of the most consequential days in all of Jewish history. It was on this day, in a small museum in Tel Aviv, that senior members of the Jewish Yeshiva, led by David Ben Gurion, declared the existence of a Jewish state in their ancestral homeland to be called the State of Israel. It was at this fateful moment that Ben Gurion read out a text from a scroll, which would become known as Israel's Declaration of Independence. This remarkable document not only announced to the world that the Jews had reconstituted their ancient state, but also provided a historical and philosophical justification for its existence, as well as a basic template for the values and laws that would be at the heart of this new political entity. Today we will be probing some of the many questions that surround this crucial text. How was it written and by whom? What were the major philosophies or ideologies influencing this text, and what kind of state was envisioned by its founders? Joining us to discuss this today is an author of a recent book on precisely the subject, Dr. Neil Rogachevsky. He is the Associate Director and Assistant Professor at the Straus Center for Torah and Western Thought at Yeshiva University, where he teaches and researches Israel studies as well as the history of political thought. His recent book, titled Israel's Declaration of Independence, The History and Political Theory of the Nation's Founding Moment, which he co-wrote with Dov Ziegler, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2022, and is certainly the book on our subject today. It is a pleasure to welcome Professor Rogachevsky to the podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Excellent. So let's jump into this extraordinary document. And to give it some sort of preface, I recall that during my undergraduate degree, which took place at Shalem College in Jerusalem, so we had a course on great modern Hebrew literature taught by a novelist and professor called Asaf Inbari, a quite brilliant teacher. And he, the very first class of this course, he did a session on precisely this text, on the Megillat HaAtzmaut, the Declaration of Independence, introducing it as one of the canonical texts created in the modern Hebrew language and in the modern Jewish canon. Would you agree with this assessment?
First, thanks again so much for having me. I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. I would agree, but interestingly, I mean, there's a sort of a personal biography there. I don't know if I would have agreed before I started looking into it. Sort of a simple reading of the text, many years ago before the research began. I said, okay, this is important. It's obviously incredibly consequential. It has some nice ideas, but I really grew to love and appreciate and admire both the content of the text and especially the political work done by the drafters over the course of researching its composition and studying the final product. So very, very much agree with Inbari. And I'd say also it is, in terms of political text, in a way we have no choice but to turn to the Declaration. It is the only formal official text from 1948 which speaks about foundational issues of politics, of government, of ideas. So we have no choice but to look at it. But luckily, I think we did come away with this beautiful, important, and truly wonderful Declaration of Independence.
Excellent. So our listeners, I hope most of them will be familiar basically with what was going on in early 1948. But if you could just provide a very brief summary of the historical moment, the political military situation that was going on at the time, and what was happening on May 14th, 1948.
Yeah, not a calm series of days in the Yeshiva, Tohu Vavohu. I love this. If you read the debates in the spring of 1948, Yeshiva leaders would use that term to describe political chaos and void, Tohu Vavohu, invoking the Bible to describe it. And it was extraordinary months. If you happen to have any contacts in Hollywood, this would make for a great movie as well. There have been so many movies about Churchill in May 1940. We saw that recent Golda Meir movie, but these days were just, at the political level, extraordinary. Really, to make the very long story short, we know, of course, that the United Nations had passed the partition plan, November 29th, 1947, calling for a Jewish state, an Arab state, and international Jerusalem. The British mandate was slated to end sometime in 1948. And that UN resolution had envisioned a very orderly process by which these new states were to emerge in the place of the British mandate. But none of that happened. The Jewish leadership, with regret, accepted the partition plan. The Arabs, led by the Arab Higher Committee, surrounding Arab states, totally boycotted the process. And basically, the War of Independence began soon after the UN resolution. in the days in April, May 1948, and Ben Gurion in particular was the best informed man in this context. He had pretty good intelligence that the invasion of the surrounding Arab states, particularly Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, was to commence as soon as the British departed. So that was the scene around May 13th, May 14th, 1948. Ben Gurion famously writes in his diary after delivering the declaration, "I mourn amidst the rejoicers," because he knew that the ultimate test was still to come. Yigal Yadin earlier that week had said our chances of survival are 50-50. So the situation was very grave. Of course, Israel, the new state declared, did hold on at an extraordinary cost. 1% of the pre-state population was casualties. So that was the historical context.
Interesting. And of course, that led to the declaration of the State of Israel on the afternoon of 14th of May. However, this particular document that was read out, as you said, it's the foundational document, and it is really the only agreed upon document because Israel doesn't have a constitution. And yet its composition history is rather unusual. It seems to have been kicked down the food chain and eventually composed, at least in large part, by those who weren't really major decision makers as such. So could you perhaps walk us a little bit through the composition history? Who drafted this document? How many drafts were there? How did it end up with what it ended up with?
Yeah, that's great, and the whole story is riveting. And one of the purposes of the book is to try to put some of these stories of the drafting of Israel's declaration into Jewish lore. That, of course, is related to the historical context. The people you mentioned, Ben Gurion, the leading lights of the Zionist movement were busy with other matters in these tumultuous months, April, May 1948. And so they kicked this process down the food chain. The story really begins with the person who was leading the effort on the judicial constitutional front, you could say, was Felix Rosenbluth, soon to be known as Pinchas Rosen, who's to be the first justice minister of the state. And he basically is in charge of the process of crafting some kind of declaration of independence. When this started in late April, there was an understanding that there would be some kind of independence after the British left, but the character of that independence was still to be determined. And yes, in the first instance, he kicked it down to the first draft. Again, this story in particular belongs in Jewish lore to a totally unknown 33-year-old man, Mordechai Beham, and he was Passover, April 1948, just before Passover. Pinchas Rosen called him to the office and said, "Draft me some kind of statement for when the British are leaving." Beham didn't quite know what to do, was perplexed, and on a Shabbat lunch, he confessed this top secret assignment to his family, and he was reminded that a learned American rabbi lives around the corner in Tel Aviv. This turned out to be a man called Harry Davidowitz, who is 61 years old in 1948. And according to family recollection, and here as honest history, we have to say that much of how this actually came together is based on recollection more than the documentary record. But we do think, as far as we can surmise, that Saturday afternoon, this Baham fellow went to the library of this American rabbi, Harry Davidowitz, and had basically a study session in the great texts of Anglo-American political thought, and together with Davidowitz and Knott, first copied down key texts of the British political tradition, some aspects of the Hebrew Bible in the King James Version, and the American Declaration of Independence. And over the next few days, in English, Beham produced the first draft of Israel's Declaration of Independence, was basically a copy of America's Declaration of Independence. It's an extraordinary text. In the book, all the various key early drafts are included, but it's this remarkable attempt to combine Philadelphia and the teaching of individual natural rights, which found their highest expression in Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. And it's really like you read through that declaration, it's largely its ideas of the purposes of government are really Anglo-American. Governments are instituted to secure individual freedoms, etc. Rights don't come from government. Government can merely protect rights. So it does that, but it also, and this, not copying from the America, it tries to establish the Jerusalem basis of Israeli independence, and it invokes one version of the covenants in Deuteronomy to justify Israel's declaration of independence. It begins, that first draft begins with, whereas the Lord God promised this land to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their seed after them, one version of the covenant in Deuteronomy. So it was actually this remarkable attempt to wrestle with a question that everyone really, and still today, we're dealing with, right? How do we, how do we have a modern Jewish state? We realize we want to do several things here. We want to be, a modern state in good standing in the post World War II era. We want to be a liberal, small L liberal state, but we also need to say something about how the Jewish heritage ought to inform our work here. So that was the attempt in this first draft, and it was really quite a remarkable attempt.
Right. I mean, it's extraordinary to me that, as you say, certainly the earlier draft of the Megillat Ta'atzmaut was put together by a fairly junior 33-year-old lawyer in consultation with his neighbor, who was a retired American conservative rabbi. That's who. Yeah, I find that there's just such a wacky backstory to one of the most consequential texts of modern Jewish life.
Yeah, absolutely right. Although someone recently reminded me that Thomas Jefferson was also 33 in 1776, but Jefferson was already, he was on a rocket ship in his career, already, a high up person in the colonies. And yeah, it just gets better and better. I mean, you look into who this rabbi was, Harry Davidowitz. He was a highly idiosyncratic person. He wasn't working as a pulpit rabbi in Tel Aviv. He spent his days translating Shakespeare. He worked on medieval Jewish philosophy. A very whimsical, idiosyncratic fellow, who also, he hadn't been born in the United States, but had, received his education there. He'd imbibed, I think, the virtues of the Anglo-American political tradition, and he saw that, okay, if we're going to declare a state, again, totally far away from the diplomatic issues, which were, to occupy the leading lights of the Yeshiva. But he saw through to the fundamental theoretical question. We need to do three things here. We need to have a state, a strong state. We need to have a state of equal rights, of individual natural rights. We want our state to protect that. And we want to say something about its Jewish basis. And at the level of principles, those are, sort of the three things that, a declaration of independence for the Jewish state ought to really reflect. And so they attempted to produce this. It didn't stand. And the story, what happens next is that, this draft in a way couldn't have stood. Most of, the fellow bureaucrats working in this, this proto justice ministry, dubbed the legal department at the time, had no exposure to, Anglo-American political thought, and they moved subsequent drafts in very different directions.
Right. So, okay, fine. So those are the next phases. This draft, various drafts, goes up through the ranks of the senior leadership of the Yeshiva. To what extent did Ben Gurion himself have a hand in the final composition, or whose fingerprints are on the final version of this draft?
Yeah, so our claim is that, I get a semi-controversial paper with the title David Ben Gurion's Declaration of Independence recently at an academic conference, but I think that really expresses it. Ben Gurion said himself, later on, he modestly edited the text that had been given to him, or agreed upon by his colleagues, May 13th, 1948. But if you actually look at it, he put his indelible stamp on it and fundamentally transformed what had been given to him by his colleagues. Because, to make a very long story short, this initial effort in the first draft to articulate, Israeli independence on the basis of these three principles had been replaced by, first a labor Zionist effort, which really stressed the work of the Chalutzim, the Mafilim, the pioneers, and then an effort on the basis of, international law, which stressed the basis of Israeli independence in international precedents, including the partition plan and the rise and fall of the UN partition plan, and then also the penultimate draft being based on pure diplomatic considerations written by Moshe Sharet, what would appeal to the leading lights in Washington who were wavering over whether to recognize Israel independence, or in some cases were actively working to undermine the cause of Israeli independence. So Ben Gurion had to deal with these drafts, which he judged insufficient. And on the night, the small hours between May 13th and May 14th fundamentally, transformed this text and made it really into his own in important ways.
Wow. That's that alone could be, as you say, a basis for an interesting movie. But Ben Gurion in the wee hours of May 14th, poring over the scroll, scratching out words he didn't like, crossing out whole paragraphs, just, fundamentally rewording the whole thing.
Rework amidst like also taking calls from the military people, planning the war effort. I mean, those are just it must have been some of the most extraordinary hours in Jewish history. And of course, early morning May 14th, that there's a big meeting of the assembled proto parliament, 37 people that had to put the final rubber stamp on the text of the declaration before it was declared that afternoon, 4 p.m.
Right, which indeed they did. So let's jump into some of the ideas of this particular text. So firstly, I mean, to what extent? Okay, so actually, let's start from the very beginning. I mean, you started mentioning this, but what are the major themes of this text? I mean, anyone can go read it online. It's available in several translations, also official translations. But basically, what are the central things that this document seeks to do?
Yeah. So my claim is that our claim in the book is that Ben Gurion sort of came back to these three pillars or three chief principles, which were apparent right away in this first draft. And I like to put it this way: there's the pillar one of sovereignty, and the nature of sovereign independence, and pillar two would be the character of the Jewish state. And here we have a vision of the Jewish state as Jewish, but capaciously or pluralistically defined. And finally, the third pillar, a state of rights, a state of equality for all, a state not of Jewish supremacy, but a state that is liberal in the in the small L sense, precisely because it is Jewish, not in deviation from its Judaism. So there are plenty of other important ideas in the text of the Declaration. It relates in a fascinating way to, we said, international diplomatic precedents. Jewish history. Its treatment of Jewish history is important. But really, I think those are its central pillars at the level of ideas. This is going to be a sovereign state, fully independent. It's going to be a Jewish state capaciously defined. And it's going to be a liberal state or free state, a state of rights. And the argument of the text is that these pillars ought to reinforce one another. We're going to use our liberal side to strengthen the Jewish character of the state. Similarly, Judaism is going to reinforce the liberal side. It's not a text of 19th century reformers. It doesn't claim, I don't think, that Judaism and liberalism are the same thing, but it does sort of have this argument to the effect that these ideas can go together, and we're called upon in a way to live creatively with these ideas all together. So pretty extraordinary, I think.
Yes, 100%. Now, let me ask. I mean, you mentioned the American Declaration of Independence, written by Jefferson famously. So with that, there is a very discernible philosophy, and especially philosopher. I mean, John Locke's influence on that is absolutely massive, and it has a certain very specific outlook on life. Is there the same sort of thing in the Israeli Declaration of Independence? Meaning, is there a specific philosophy or philosopher, political outlook, maybe other documents such as the Declaration of the Rights of Man or the U.S. Declaration of Independence? What great ideological statements or ideological systems are lurking in the background of this particular document, if any?
Yes, it's so interesting, and here you do have to think of this work as a product of the Yeshiva as a whole, and you can find touches of so many aspects of the Jewish and you could say modern liberal tradition within it. Certainly Herzl, the Zionist movement, it is a Zionist text as well, and the teaching, pillar one on sovereignty, that this is going to be an independent state. That doesn't ask permission from the UN or the Americans or anyone else. No, it's sovereignty is seen as an assertion, as a political claim that you make. That is that's an idea that Jefferson beautifully expresses in the American Declaration, but it's also teaching of Herzl, and Herzl, of course, his name is invoked. So it is, I think, a fulfillment of the political teaching of Zionism at the level of sovereign independence. It's a claim of sovereign independence, and it relies on the Zionist teachings. Zionism is really transformation of certain aspects of the Jewish tradition at that level, that we embrace a political future. So that's that really is quite important. But you can look at other things. There's a touch of Hadam and cultural Zionism in this first paragraph in the invocation of Sefer HaSfarim, the book of books. The national universal import of the book of books, so that that needs to be drawn out. And also in its statement of rights, I mean, that's a complicated story. Best in class is America's Declaration of Independence on the character of rights. Why? Because it tells you what they are, where they come from, what are the origin of rights. It speaks so clearly as to the indelible inherent character of rights and the responsibilities of government. Israel's declaration doesn't do that; it simply lists rights. But through that, you can trace you go back through this, and you trace the development of the liberal tradition from 17th, 18th century to modern times. Famously, also put it in Berlinian terms. The American Declaration stresses negative rights alone. Israel's declaration speaks of both social and political rights, negative and positive rights, as a very expansive list of rights that the state ought to embody or protect. But it's still recognizably within this long liberal tradition, which stretches back to Locke. So all kinds of sources, and then the way the invocation, the choice is made, about the Jewish language invoked, the parts of the Bible mentioned in general, although not very specifically in this text, all point to some fascinating problems, which one would have to look at as well.
Right, we'll absolutely touch upon those because the question of religion in this text is fascinating. I want to get to one or two other things before we get to that. One of them is as you state, the comparison with the American Declaration of Independence is very instructive, because the American Declaration of Independence has a philosophy, has a philosophical understanding of self-evident truths of pursuing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as being inalienable human rights, and therefore one could imagine that the American Declaration of Independence could have been written by any group of human beings anywhere at any time. Let's say, I mean, obviously, history does decide these sorts of things, but these rights, they could have been imagined by anyone at any given point, and asserted as basic human rights. Whereas the Israeli Declaration of Independence starts very much with history. It seems to be much more concerned with history. It seems to base many more of its claims to legitimacy in, let's say, the Jewish role in antiquity, or a sort of resurrection of what the Jewish people once were. Is this correct? I mean, can one state, I know this is a little bit of an overgeneralization, but can one perhaps state that the American Declaration is philosophically based or philosophically infused, with the Israeli one is much more leaning on a particular history of a particular people?
Yeah, so that's plausible, and there's certainly much more history in Israel's declaration, and here you can compare it to, say, other national other liberal national movements of the 19th and 20th century, right? The story of either birth or the rebirth on a specific piece of land, and of course, land is not at all mentioned in America's Declaration of Independence, whereas it is the beginning of Israel's Declaration of Independence. But I think I actually don't agree. I mean, what I see is that there is this effort, and you see this by following the evolution of the text. And you asked about Ben Gurion. You see Ben Gurion sees that history itself is not enough. History tells you something. The fact that the Jews longed for the return to the land, that's in the first few paragraphs of the text, is certainly revealing. It's something to marvel at. But it poses a question: why are you longing to return there? And that right away, that brings you into the level beyond mere traditional or historical attachment, and you have to reckon with the intellectual claim, right? Or as you put it, the philosophical claim. So what Ben Gurion tries to do is he doesn't minimize the history, the longing of the Jews to return, the fact that they were there in antiquity, but he tries to give an explanation for that. He tries to embed it, and as you say, I mean, it's a nice segue to talk about religion. Happy to take this wherever you like. In that first paragraph, he tries to connect it to the universal ideas found in Sefer HaSarim, the Book of Books. So the history, in a way, is given value by virtue of its connection to the intellectual heritage of the Jewish world. According to the argument of the first paragraph, the Jews gave to the world the Book of Books. In the official English translation, there are many difficulties with this, but that is said to be of universal, national and universal significance. So it's an attempt to connect the particular story, the particular history of Israel's attachment to a universal idea, namely, the Jewish ideas of justice have been a boon to all of humankind, and we're claiming that in order for those ideas to continue their journey through world history, the Jews ought to have a state. So it's history, but it's also more than history. It's an attempt to speak of the Jewish idea of justice in philosophic terms, and base our claims to statehood on that pursuit of justice.
This is absolutely the case. It's very interesting that there is it does seem to be this attempt to do two things at once. I mean, to affirm the particularity of Jewish history and Jewish contribution, but also to extend that. In fact, the expression that you've quoted a couple of times in the Hebrew, it's Sefer HaSfarim HaNitzchi, the eternal book of books. That's very interesting because that's a very universal way of describing the Tanakh. In fact, it doesn't even say the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible or anything like that. It says the book of books, or the great book, or the book.
Yeah, absolutely right. Very, very perceptive. Ben Gurion often spoke of the Bible in those terms, and someone else in the committee, the lone Sephardic member of the Committee of 13 that had been charged with overseeing the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, he had he was really upset with a previous draft. He said, "Where is Sefer HaSfarim in this text?" So maybe the phrase stuck out. So when Ben Gurion wrote that first paragraph, but he often referred to it this way. But this goes to this question of the principles, right? There is this attempt to push to accentuate the universalistic aspect of the Jewish tradition and speak of it in terms not of Jewish law or of Jewish particularity, but in terms of its universal ethical content of the Jewish tradition. And that's really important, I think, in a political context, because the state is just going to be a state. They recognized at the time that there was going to be incredible diversity amongst Jews. There are going to be non-Jewish members of the state. So there was always this effort, and we see later on in the text, the vision of the prophets are invoked, and the vision of the prophets, freedom, justice, and peace, bringing out universal ideas of justice and peace within that tradition. So you follow this Sur Yisrael, the way God, these things are put in quite universalistic terms, and it's part of, I think, of this discourse between the Jewish side and the liberal side, because the state is just going to be, to repeat, they're going to be non-Jewish members of the state. It's going to be their state as much as it is people who are Jewish, and of course, among the Jews are going to differ to large degree on the meaning of their Judaism, right? The meaning of the principles of justice. There's lots of room for interpretation there. So one can't be too specific. One has to speak in general terms, and one has to attempt. And whether they did this perfectly in the Declaration of Independence or not, I don't know. One had to try to attempt to distill principles of Jewish ethics for politics, right? Say what's political in Jewish, and that's a very hard task, right? And it's still up to us to do more work in this domain. But that's really what the text attempts to do, I think.
Yes, and I mean, there's another, perhaps, I don't know, controversial is perhaps not the right word, a way of looking at the text, which is that in many ways the Megillat Ha'atzmaut is intentionally vague. In certain ways. So, you mentioned Sur Yisrael, which is, of course, the way that the Declaration of Independence theoretically referred to God, or at least, the Rock of Israel. Whether that's a capital R rock or a lowercase r rock is, obviously open to interpretation. And the same with Sefer HaSfarim and others. I mean, do you think that's part of this endeavor? Because the Declaration of Independence does skate over important things. It doesn't attempt to justify everything. As you say, it's asserted rights that the individual has and that the state must provide or protect, rather than try and ground it in some sort of philosophy. I mean, is there a way in which the Declaration of Independence is trying to shirk its duty to provide a philosophical background? It's just saying, listen, here's what we believe, and that's it.
Yeah, on the question of rights, I mean, that's one area where perhaps they maybe could have done a little better than just listing the rights as they did. So maybe that's one area you'd say okay, 7 or 8 out of 10, because it still lists. I mean, it still lists. I mean, the list of rights, it gives freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, safeguarding the holy place of all religions, minority. It's a beautiful list, and they do stem from the liberal. Those are implications of the philosophic basis as it's articulated in America's Declaration and other places in the liberal tradition. It just doesn't itself give a philosophic account for rights. So I take that criticism, but otherwise I see the vague. I don't see it as shirking responsibility. I see it as this kind of ambiguity as a kind of strength, because this was and this is where the history really matters. 37 people had to ultimately sign this document, from communists on the left to a bunch of rabbis, right-wing revisionists on the right, left-wing rabbis, right-wing. The extraordinary diversity in the Yeshiva had to sign off on this, and so even as it was the work of Ben Gurion, in a sense, it was you had an impossible task. You had to speak for the Jews of Palestine in 1948. You had to speak for the Jews of the world in their unity, but also in their diversity. And you had to leave room. Elsewhere, I've said, there's constructive ambiguity in its invocation of Judaism, for instance. You see this in the Sur Yisrael, Rock of Israel example you mentioned, but also in the invocation of, the vision of the prophets, Sefer HaSarim, biblical justice. So you don't actually say what that is, because that's very hard to say. Someone on the left is going to have one version of that. Different prophets have different versions of justice. Figuring out what the political meaning of these texts is very, very difficult. But we do know that they're exceptionally valuable. So it had to, and just in the political context, you couldn't do, like, in a way, you couldn't do more. So we talked about in that first draft, this invocation, one invocation of the covenant in Deuteronomy. That in the actual text of Israel's Declaration of Independence would have been impossible. No one one or two members of 37 would have signed off on that. That's too theocratic. Invoking God's promise to the children of Israel. Many people in the room that day, if they saw that as a first paragraph of Hebrew or Zionist independence, this kind of mentality is what I left Europe to escape. I want to be like, we're here to be like all the other nations. And so you had a very difficult political task to accomplish, and I think he accomplished it pretty well. We're going to invoke the Jewish tradition. We're going to say we're more than a kibbutz on the Mediterranean here. We're more we're more than Silicon Valley on the Mediterranean. On the other hand, we're not a theocracy. We're not simply ethno-national states. Somehow, Jewish ideas are part of part of what we're doing here is protecting the people, so that they can continue their work of articulating these ideas which emanate from the Book of Books.
Interesting. I suppose we ought to remind our listeners a little bit something that we're also used to thinking about nowadays, which is that just how extremely hostile to religion many of these early Zionists were. In other words, nowadays we're used to, firstly, a large portion of the citizenry of the State of Israel either being religious or Masorati, sort of somewhat traditional, and therefore, very much willing, in fact, eager to, invoke religious principles or use religious paraphernalia when it suits them. And even secularists in Israel today, many of them, have grown to nod along and accept the presence of religion in various state ceremonies, for instance, and in military ceremonies as well, and invoking the Bible and all sorts of things like that, and singing of religious songs and rabbi speaking. Whereas in early Israel, in the Yeshuv time, this was absolutely not the case. The form of, as far as I can see, as in this was much, much more rare, and many more powerful people were, as you say, saw the state of Israel as precisely the way in which the Jewish people could emancipate themselves from an oppressive religious past.
Yeah, very, very important historical fact to have it front of mind when talking about this and looking at as you say, the astonishing development of Israel, specifically over the last decades. Although we'll see, the major wars have changed Israel in the past. We'll see how the current war, scrambles the religious question, which I think it will. That could go in many ways. But yeah, that's very important. And you see, we didn't talk about what we dubbed sort of the labor Zionist drafts, and how they, after this first draft, and this in a way, if you're open to religion, or you want to have something on the Jewish ethical tradition, you want to relate to it somehow in the state, you gain more admiration for what Ben Gurion had done when you see these early drafts, which literally said nothing about the Jewish ethical tradition at all. The draft written by Tzvi Beronzon, future Supreme Court Justice Minister, the so-called labor Zionist draft of Israel's declaration, simply states the Jews had a historical and traditional connection to the land of Israel. Doesn't say anything else at all about religion or Judaism, and that would have been acceptable to a fairly substantial proportion of the political people at the upper echelons of the Yeshuv. Americans, often like to talk about Ben Gurion's rivalry with Begin and the revisionists. That's important, but in 47, 48, this is, working on some stuff related to this now. Ben Gurion's chief rivals were really from the left rank, the Mapam party, the breakaway. There had been a schism in the labor movement earlier in the 1940s. And the Mapam people, Aaron Zisling, for instance, who was on this Council of 13, these were ardent secularists. Some of them were calling for open alliance with Moscow, in the spring of 1948. And these are the people Ben Gurion really had to contend with, at the level of political ideas, such as in the drafting of the Declaration of Independence, but also in the politics of the War of Independence. So the fact that he was able to muster what he did, he was right down the middle. In this the middle way he accomplished was rather extraordinary.
It's actually very interesting to think of the Declaration of Independence of Israel as a document that was forged precisely in a tug of war between various competing sides, and Ben Gurion frantically trying to hold on to the middle and try and satisfy all sides. And there's actually one interesting phrase, just staying on the religion point for a moment. I mean, well, two actually. First, I believe I heard you mention elsewhere that originally, or there was a proposal to have the phrase "mitoch bitachon b'tzur Yisrael," right? That is what's written, within or due to our faith in the Rock of Israel. However, there was a draft which included Tzur Yisrael v'go'alo, the Rock of Israel and its Redeemer, capital R Redeemer, which would have been much more, let's say, explicitly theocentric, or invoke something which is undeniably a sort of personal divine force in history, which presumably didn't make the cut.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. No, that isn't in a prior draft, but Menachem Begin gives a radio address the next day, Saturday night, which basically expresses on these three principles I mentioned: sovereignty, Jewish state capaciously defined, and rights. I think it's pretty similar to the Declaration of Independence. It's kind of interesting, but he clearly, having heard the Declaration of Independence, he said, "Sur Yisrael v'go'alo," Rock of Israel and his Redeemer. We have an active God who's watching over our proceedings today and intervening in history on our behalf. There's a self-mythologizing aspect to Ben Gurion here. Every Israeli, up until there's much more interest in the Declaration of Independence now over the last few years, but up until a few years ago, this was the one story from that period which Israelis really knew about, which was this context over Tzur Yisrael, the Rock of Israel and his Redeemer, May 13th, May 14th, when he was writing the draft between May 13th and May 14th. He was visited late at night by a rabbi, Aryeh Leb Fishman Maimon, who says, "Look, we need Tzur Yisrael v'go'alo. Rock of Israel itself is not enough." And by Aaron Zisling, this far left atheist, who said, "Don't make me express my faith in the Rock of Israel." And what did he do? This is Ben Gurion wanted this to be remembered. Oh, I'm the man of compromise. I'm leaving this in. Tzur Yisrael. We talked before this that you're going to do a podcast on a series of podcasts on Spinoza. This perhaps has been Gurion's Spinozistic side coming out. He said, "Okay, Rock of Israel, it's a beautiful phrase because you can interpret, if you're a materialist, if you're a far left atheist, you can interpret it as the Zionist strength, the force of Jewish history, belief in our own arms, something like that. And if you're more traditionally minded, you see that this is a name of God." I actually think that's a little too much has been made of that. Specifically, because Tzur Yisrael is known as it's a name of God. It's recognizable in the liturgy as a name of God. I mean, it's famously not a biblical phrase. And interestingly, that's actually the one thing from the first draft which is maintained. The rabbi, the Maimonidean rabbi, this was the term he chose for Jefferson's divine providence
interesting.
Yeah, exactly, to put the America's Declaration of Independence into Hebrew. And so it is it's hard to see that and not say that it's God, and that's how it's been understood even without Redeemer. But it's still Ben Gurion's approach here is still really was his approach on religious and cultural issues through most of his life. He was looking for this sort of compromise or pluralistic position from the point of view of the statesman, which it differs in a way from the point of view of the theologian is writing an essay or philosopher or whatever. The statesman says these issues, we're not going to resolve these issues, right? And if we try to resolve them definitively, that's going to create some kind of political problems for us. So let's keep the buy-in in our state, both from the secular side and from the more religious side, from the million variations on that, and you'll see as things develop over time. To me, that speaks to Ben Gurion's prudence, and it was apparent also. You follow his approach to religion at the political level in 1949, 1950. You see him following a similar thing. Many of his colleagues on the left, facing the prospects of mass immigration of Jews from Arab lands, said, "What we need to do, we need to turn these people into a good atheist labor Zionist. We need to redo the second Aliyah. We'll put them into one homogenous school system in Israel. We'll get them to remove the trappings of the ancient faith, and that's the only way we'll be a success here." Ben Gurion, he advocated for pluralism. No, we're going to allow people to follow their own their own religious understanding. And Ben Gurion was really responsible for the pluralistic education system, which developed subsequently in Israel. So sort of he doesn't get enough credit for that. I don't think.
That's fascinating. Yeah, so yes, that is definitely one phrase which can be finagled very well, because Tzur Yisrael, either God or like some force in history. It's fascinating to me that you say that this was the rabbi's translation of Jefferson's Nature's God, right? Because of course Tzur Yisrael is heavily particularistic. I mean, it mentions Israel right there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
it's not that's an important thing. Another interesting phrase.
No. Let me just say, it wasn't for nature's God. It was for the end of America's the firm reliance on divine providence.
Oh, I see. Okay, fine.
Yeah,
okay, that's a bit more.
Yeah, but still, you're right. You're right that your point still stands, of course. Right, Tzur Yisrael. Yeah.
There's another arresting sentence I always find in the Declaration of Independence, which is its very first phrase, because that also is heavily ambiguous and also, on the one hand, extremely traditional, extremely untraditional. And the phrase is Be'eretz Yisrael kam ha'am ha'yehudi, right? That, as the official translation, is that the land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. But it's not, I mean, that's not quite a fully accurate translation, because it basically means in the land of Israel, the Jewish people arose or established themselves or achieved existence. I don't know exactly how perfectly to render the word kam ha'am ha'yehudi. So there's two issues. One is, what exactly is meant by that, but also this is a staggeringly untraditional phrase in a way, for the simple reason that, at least according to the biblical narrative, Eretz Yisrael is exactly not where the Jews came into their being as a people, rather, of course, in Egypt and outside the land. And in fact, one might argue that according to the biblical narrative, it's very important the Jewish people are not indigenous to the land of Israel.
That's right.
Because the entire covenant between the Jews and their God is exactly that God will give them a land, that they're not the indigenous inheritors naturally of their land, where God will give them the land. In response, the Jewish people will keep God's laws, and thereby the covenant will stand. But to assert that Eretz Yisrael is the place in which the Jewish people were come, they came into establishment, I don't know, that phrase always, it arrests you straight away.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And there are certain readers who look at that and say like, oh, this is a heretical text from its very first sentence. As you say, the Hebrew is softer, right? The English, like there's an official English translation. We don't actually know who wrote it. I think it was probably Moshe Sharet, but I don't know. The Hebrew is softer, right? Because the emergence of the Jewish people, birthplace is like, yeah, precisely that. Is directly counters the Jewish tradition. I think the Jews. I used to always say alone of the people of antiquity, emerged outside of their land. That land wasn't constitutive of identity. I think the Romans, post the Aeneid at least, the Romans themselves said they were strangers before they came to Rome. I don't know if they were under Hebraic influence when Virgil reconstituted Roman identity. I don't know. Don't think so, but that's kind of interesting. But yeah, you're right. The indigeneity argument is a problematic one. But again, here too, I think that there are all kinds of ways one could criticize this. If the Canaanite tendency and the Canaanites were those Hebraeus who wanted to move beyond Judaism completely and just speak of the indigenous character of the Hebrews. That was a strong-ish movement. You could say that its influence was overstated in the Yeshiva and then early Israel. If they had their way, this tendency would have been way stronger. And you could look at it from one point of view, okay, as another aspect of trying to satisfy all the different constituencies. People are focused on land, people are focused on history, people are focused on the pioneers, people are focused on the Bible. Whatever your flavor of ice cream, you could in a way find it. But I still think that the logic of that first paragraph, it goes beyond the historical question or even theological question towards this question of Jewish ideas and the heritage of the Bible, the ethical principles that emerge out of the Bible, and really you could say the whole Jewish tradition. And it isn't, as you rightly notice, it isn't specific about those, but I think you couldn't be that specific about them. Maybe you could have in some respect. Begin in the speech, Menachem Begin gives this radio address, let's say Shabbat, Saturday 15th, and he's a bit more specific about the principles of biblical justice insofar as they'll inform the Jewish state. He says, remember you were a stranger in Egypt. Which is a beautiful thing to invoke at the time. And this goes to this effort to connect the Jewish and liberal side of the state. We have minority rights. We have freedom of conscience because we're Jewish. not in deviation from him. And here I'm pointing to a specific text in Deuteronomy, which speaks of, the equal treatment for minorities that live amongst you, the dignity of all human beings. This is a Jewish principle. We don't simply get that from the liberal side. So Begin was concrete in that way, in a very beautiful way. I think so. Perhaps one could have said more, but the effort here in this first paragraph and throughout the text, I think set us in the right direction for thinking about what the modern Jewish state has to be: liberal state, and a Jewish state pluralistically defined.
Interesting. I would like to turn to something you started mentioning a little bit, but important, to see if there are any other elements that you could think of, which is so what got cut from the draft? In other words, we ended up with what Ben Gurion sort of heavily polished, as he said, but modestly edited. Aside from, you mentioned the very heavily Americanized, form of the Declaration of Independence, what else ended up on the cutting room floor that we know of?
Yeah, so the thing everyone stresses above all is democracy, right? The word demokratia, right? Chanted in the streets, for 12 months in Israel before the war broke out. So that was in some earlier drafts. It was in earlier political statements, and it was in this the draft I mentioned by Steve Berenson. Says that the state will be democratic. And Israelis have puzzled. I think, honestly, they've made too much about this absence, but that's always, people are critical of the text. You could say from the more liberal side have said, Eifo ha-demokratia, in this. So to that, I would say two things. Like, first, it was just resoundingly obvious to everyone that the state that was to emerge was to conduct itself by democratic means, i.e. elections. And the fact that there are going to be elections, that's in vogue. Okay, the word democracy is in there, but the procedural aspect of democracy is pointed to by the fact that it says, until the provisional government will rule until there to be elections, i.e., our process of government is going to be a democratic one at the procedural level. So that's one, democracy understood in its procedural sense, but also in its substantive sense. Like, what do we want? We use this word democracy pretty carelessly in our time. I think when we say democracy, we like it. It's because we think of the substantive rights that democracy ought to protect, these freedoms we talk about, equality before the law, the rights of individuals, and in the Jewish state, these other aspects, rights of all faiths, protection of the holy site, of all rights. So that's in a way what we expect from democracy in terms of the substance of rights. And the text speaks of this in spades, right? It is so clear that this will be a text that protects the substantive rights of individuals. Ben Gurion was asked about the absence of the word democracy in the text. And statesmen are pretty funny this way. You look at Churchill, de Gaulle, other statesmen in the 20th century, they're always looking to express, some universal concepts in a native vernacular. So, an interviewer asked Ben Gurion, why, demokratia? In the text, he said, well, for us, I get my ideas of substantive rights from the prophets and from the Jewish tradition more than I get it from the Greek word demokratia. And so I try to express these notions of freedom and work and, the kind of life we want here in Jewish terms. And so I think that it's, there's been too much hullabaloo over its absence, but that's really been, you could say the most important thing that was left on the cutting board. Another thing, we didn't even talk about this. We talked about, as a podcast of intellectual history, so we talked about the philosophical, theological ideas more, but there are many things that are left related to the diplomatic context of this. Were borders to be mentioned or not in the text, the final borders of the state? How do you relate to the UN resolution? We haven't spent much time on this, but that is the core of the political debate at the time. How much to say about the United Nations resolution? Do we bind ourselves to the specifics of what the UN did, or do we just commit in some general way to the principle expressed by the UN? And to cut a long story short, that's what they opt for, the latter. They change it such that the text recognizes the principle of UN Resolution 181, November 29, 1947, that there ought to be a Jewish state, but it doesn't commit the Jewish state to living up to every aspect of all the details of UN Resolution 181. Why? Because it had been totally rejected. It had been a dead letter. The Arabs launched this war against the Jews. Fighting was everywhere. No, it was impossible to conceive on by May 14th, 1948, that the borders that emerged after the war would be those borders which were in the UN resolution. So it was another example of constructive ambiguity on the part of Ben Gurion.
Right. It's interesting to me because it seems certainly the second half of the Declaration of Independence, after the actual declaration, after the declaration there is a state, or that there will now be a state, is that there seems to be quite a lot of things that are what one almost might call wishful thinking. One of them is the peace with the Arab nations. Another one is the construction of a constitution, which was supposed to come into effect by October 1948. We're still waiting for that 75 years later. Or more. Do you see these as things, and as you say, hewing to UN Resolution 181 and all these things, which was quite clear at the time would not happen. There wouldn't be peace with the Arab nations. There wouldn't be perfect concordance with the UN resolution. So was that baked in? In other words, was there an assumption that, okay, we're going to state these things and, they're not really going to happen, but it's nice to have them on paper? Or was there really an expectation, perhaps, and certainly with drafting a constitution, that some of these things might actually come into being?
So it really depended, on the constitutional question. Some eagerly looked forward to it. Others were not concerned. That there were many opinions on that. In truth, it wasn't debated at all. It wasn't on anyone's mind in months of 48. But that's not surprising. Constitution, just as with the Americans, you can only write a constitution when you've won your war of independence and you're fixed and you have some leisure to contemplate that stuff. Whereas a Declaration of Independence, often is issued in wartime, or in these tumultuous political circumstances. But no, if you look at it, many of the linguistic choices in the Declaration of Independence come out of this UN resolution process, and were put there to satisfy the United Nations that this state was going to be in a state of good standing in the family of nations in the post World War II era. The United Nations had stipulated. I don't know why. I mean, there's a pretty successful country called Britain, which has had no written constitution, still did pretty well. But the UN had said any new state which is to be admitted into the UN has to have a constitution. So that's really why they put that in there. So many of those choices, and you're right, many of those things, which are in there were immediately overwhelmed by events. But to me, I mean, that really doesn't matter. Many of the things in America's declaration too, and question of your relations with the king are also now just artifacts of history. Why the Declaration remains relevant is because these principles, these three pillars, are really timeless and can still, I think, orient us today.
The final question I want to pose is regarding the effect or the legacy of this particular document. Legal considerations aside, because this document is sometimes invoked in court as sort of important legal precedent, almost like a constitution itself, but just more culturally and ideologically within Israel. Are there movements, streams of Israeli politics or Israeli society which view this document as foundational to their worldview, who say we are loyal to the principles of the Declaration of Independence? Because in America you find that the constitutionalists, the literalists, the originalists, that is really a powerful ideological stream. I haven't heard that so much in Israel, but that's why I'm asking. Perhaps I'm wrong.
No, what you just said, loyal. I mean, that was a very popular bumper sticker during the judicial reform protests over the last year, loyal to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. So it's a fascinating question. That's why it's so riveting to work on this topic. A lot of this is really up in the air at the moment. They're like this question of principles. We're in before the war. We'll see what happens after the war. There's so much contestation over the principled basis of Israel, and as a result of it, and the situation is highly dynamic. But in this context, I think the historical story here is like the growth, the explosive growth of the Declaration of Independence and the role it's played in Israel's public life, really over the last few years, explosion. But really, there's a process there in the last 10, 15, 20 years where it's come to be more important, and where some people, yes, are defining themselves according to the vision of the Declaration. I think the vision is, what I've expressed today, this kind of interesting, and very noble liberal nationalism. Other people have different opinions of that, but it's beginning to play this role. And I think, one reason is we're in a kind of crisis of Israeli democracy, stemming from the failure to form governments over the last half decade. The ultra partisanship, etc. So people have been looking back. But also there's this sense after 75 years of founding generation is no longer with us. In the past, if you wanted to know what Ben Gurion and Begin were doing, they've been dead for a while, but people who are very close to them were still alive. So sort of the haze of the founding fathers, as it were, was still loomed over contemporary Israel. Now that generation is mostly gone, and so there's this revived interest in turning back to words, to texts that they produce, to speeches, to all these documents. And there are some parallels with the American case there also. Like founderism was huge in the United States, like wasn't always huge, right? This was a project of Abraham Lincoln in the beginning of the 1830s, 1840s, to get Americans to look back to the work of Jefferson and others at the level of ideas as a way to orient the Americans going forward. So there may be a similar process underway in Israel. Whether the declaration can be that text, I don't know. I mean, I've come to great love and admiration for the text, but if you put the declaration to a vote in the Knesset today, I think it'd have a majority, but certainly wouldn't be 120. So these matters are really, really up for political debate.
In a way, it's almost a pity they didn't, ratify a constitution when they could, because it seems that, at least at the time, they had an overwhelming, broadly left-wing Zionist consensus in Israel, whereas now with all the multiple streams, it seems an absolute pipe dream to get a majority on a constitution.
Subject for a different conversation. I myself am not in favor of a constitution at the time nor today, but if it was going to be done, I agree with you. That was probably the moment. But again, Ben Gurion himself said, no, we're not going to do this. But that's a story for another day.
Fantastic. Okay, well, perhaps we'll have you on another day and talk about that. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, Professor Rogachevsky, for coming on the podcast of Jewish Ideas and enlightening us all. This has been a wonderful conversation.
I had a great time. Thanks so much for having me.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Elisha Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Elisha Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit TorahInMotion.org/donate.